Hi, I'm Drew Wilson from FreezeNet. Today, as you can tell, the table is back and once again it is show and tell time. Definitely for the last time this year because I have nothing else left to showcase, but today I wanted to do the PlayStation 3 showcase, which is all the games I played throughout 2022 and just looking back at what I played. Now, if you'll remember, I did do a PlayStation 3 retrospective about this time last year, and it was an interesting experience to say the least. So I decided to do, once again, kind of follow through the tradition and do it this year as well. So without further ado, I wanted to kick things off quickly and showcase the first game I played this year, which is Uncharted 3. Now, Uncharted 3 is a follow-up to a series I played throughout 2021, and it's the last game for this particular console. And I have to say it was an okay experience, nothing anything too special, but it did have its action sequences, it did have its storytelling, that sort of thing. So it was an okay game, just not necessarily my style of game necessarily. So after that, another series I wanted to continue from the previous year to this last year was, of course, the Motorstorm series. So after playing Motorstorm, I started playing Motorstorm Pacific Rift. Sorry. And Motorstorm Pacific Rift was a follow-up to the Motorstorm game, as I mentioned, and it really carried on a lot of what made the game good. You had the tracks with like multiple vehicles that you could play and race at the same time. It had multiple routes where you had strengths and weaknesses for different vehicles that it was encouraged that you actually play those particular routes, and it was a very interesting gaming experience, and I definitely recommend playing that particular game because I enjoyed that quite a lot. And of course, because I was curious about the rest of the series, and while I may not be able to fully play every game in this series, I was able to get my hands on Motorstorm Apocalypse. And I thought, well, it actually has some promise because it's kind of changing things up and doing some things differently, like going into an apocalyptic setting as opposed to, a dirt road setting type of deal. And I have to say I was actually very disappointed in this game because it took away a lot of the non-linear nature of the particular franchise, and you only had like a couple characters and you just played linearly. And it was kind of a disappointing follow-up to the series in my opinion. And afterwards, and I started realizing as I'm going along here that I am playing a lot of racing games. I guess that's just how it worked out. But the next game I ended up playing is Grid 2. And Grid 2 was that game that had the interesting rewind feature where if you messed up, you crashed your car into a cliffside or you drove your car off a cliff, no worries, you could actually hit a button and rewind to the previous point. And that was an interesting concept because otherwise there's a certain element of luck involved in particular racing games, but this game actually took that away and incorporated something that allowed you to at least replay like sudden mistakes that happened during the race. And I thought it was an interesting concept. And it turned out to be an okay game all around, I have to say. And yes, there was those live events as well, where you basically played basically played randomly generated tracks. It wasn't quite what I had envisioned, but again, this ended up being an interesting game all around. So that was followed up by Midnight Club Los Angeles Complete Edition. And this game I also actually thought had a lot of promise because it had the open world concept. You could drive to different events in this grid-like city. And I thought, oh, this is going to be kind of like Need for Speed Underground 2 where you could do the same thing. And unfortunately, it ended up being a bit of a disappointment. The fast travel system left a bit to be desired. And the way it handled the races was, well, not the world's greatest. So a game with promise, and I ended up being kind of disappointed by that. But there was one game I was really looking forward to and I was kind of actually excited about, and I was very fortunate enough to actually, play the game, and that was Blur. And Blur kind of had that, as one of my watchers noted after the fact, it had a combat system where you could, fire the like bolts into vehicles, you could lay mines, etc., just like Mario Kart actually. And it's something I didn't think of in the first impression video, but it was a very notable thing to point out. And it also combined that with realistic driving, or at least realistic as far as PlayStation 3 is concerned. And it ended up being a really interesting mix of concepts. And I ended up playing the game. When I ended up playing the game, I actually found myself having a really good time with that one. And there was another series there was actually a series that ended on this particular console, and it was kind of disappointing that it did end, but it did start off pretty strong. And of course, the game I ended up playing is SSX. And SSX, of course, is this famous snowboard racing game that kind of started on the PlayStation 2, and it started off very strongly, and unfortunately kind of ended on a somewhat weak point. The game itself, not bad, but it's kind of hard to see, why was this such a great series? Well, I would recommend playing the other games, but this game did have a lot of merit. Unfortunately, it did end on a somewhat weak note. So, still worth playing. I'm not sure I would say it's the world's best game, to say the least. But speaking of franchises that ended on the PlayStation 3, I ended up playing another game which I was actually very excited to check out, and that, of course, is Sly Cooper Thieves in Time. Now, this game ended, this franchise started on the PlayStation 2, and it had a lot of very strong titles, and I was very mystified as to why did this game that had such a strong start on the PlayStation 2 go on the PlayStation 3, have one title, and just peter out. And after playing this game, I would say was not much closer to an answer, because this game ended up being a very strong title, and I thoroughly enjoyed this particular game. So I was very sad to see this franchise die, no doubt to the disappointment of other fans, because it also ended on a cliffhanger too, which kind of sucked. But believe me, as a fan of Earthbound, I know the feeling all too well, what those fans are probably going through when they played that game and found out that game franchise was ending. So another game I ended up playing was sort of like one of those mandatory games. Like, if you have a PlayStation 3, you pretty much are obligated to play this particular game. And that, of course, is Gran Turismo 6. And the game franchise started on the PlayStation 1, and it was a very strong set of titles. And as it just seemed like as the game progressed, the franchise progressed, that the more kind of dull and samey the titles ended up being. And although this game introduced some very interesting concepts, it really did feel like it was one of those games that was just, offering just another kind of somewhat weak title to the franchise. So another game franchise that ended on the PlayStation 3, I'm not referring to Gran Turismo. I'm referring to more like Sly Cooper and SSX. Was the Twisted Metal series, and I ended up playing Twisted Metal for the PlayStation 3. And a lot of people will have a lot of fond memories on the PlayStation 1 where this franchise started. I was more of a mixed opinion on this particular franchise, but others were very much for this particular franchise. And I have to say, this franchise ended on a pretty weak note, because this game felt like Twisted Metal on training wheels. And by that I mean, well, You had maybe 3 characters you could play, and you could play in different vehicles, but it was also a very linear experience. And that was probably, if you haven't played this game but played other games in the series, that might be shocking, but that's what this ended up being. And I have to say, yeah, I was pretty disappointed, especially considering how much potential this game's franchise had. And although it did introduce some interesting concepts, yeah, I was still left disappointed, unfortunately. And interestingly enough, another series that ended on this particular console generation was the Max Payne series, and of course, I ended up playing Max Payne 3. And I was kind of mixed opinion on the Max Payne series. It was pretty decent. It did feel like a bit of a step back in the shooter genres, like specifically the third-person shooter genres, but it was okay. And unfortunately, the series ended on a pretty weak note with Max Payne 3 because unlike the previous Max Payne games, the story in this game, it was hard to follow, and maybe it was by design, sure, but it was hard to be really invested into the characters in that particular game. And the linear level design didn't help things either. And although it did incorporate, like, you could collect golden parts for different weapons, I'm not sure it really did enough to really justify a recommendation from me. And of course, finally, I ended up playing a game called Dirt. And this is a game made by the same company that made Grid 2, which I played earlier this year. And although they did make the Grid series, they were much more well known for the Dirt series, and I have to say I can see why, because this game ended up being a pretty solid racing game. Sure, it had its flaws like limited vehicle selection on certain races, and it ended up being like single make races half the time. But other than that, there was a lot going for this, like the way it progressed, for instance. And of course there was different kinds of races. It wasn't just dirt races that I was kind of curious about that when I made the first impression video, but it did allow for tarmac and a few other surfaces like gravel. There was also different race modes, that sort of thing, and it ended up being a pretty good experience for me. So of course this leads us to what would I recommend out of this lot? And I'll let you take a second to kind of appreciate these games and think what was your favorite ones? Which one did you like? Which one didn't you play? That sort of thing. But yeah, for me, I actually have a record number of recommendations from this particular lot, 4 of them. And those recommendations are, for me, Motorstorm Pacific Rift, Blur, Sly Cooper Thieves in Time, and of course Dirt. So a kind of an astonishing number of games I'm recommending, because normally I have like maybe 1 or 2, but yeah, this ended up being a particularly strong lineup here. And I have to say, trying to pick a favorite is quite difficult because these are all really good games. But if I had to pick a favorite, I would think really long and hard between Blur and Sly Cooper Thieves in Time, because those end up being the strongest titles throughout the year. But probably by a hair, I would say that the title for me goes to Blur. Just the way it kind of has that innovative features and the way the game plays, I ended up really liking this title. So I wanted to actually hear from you. What did you think of this particular lot? Did you agree with my recommendations? Did you think, yeah, those are really strong titles? Did you agree with my favorite, or did you like Sly Cooper or Dirt or Motorstorm better? Yeah, let us know in the comments below. And if you have any particular fond memories of any other game that was in this lot, also let me know in the comments below as well. So, if you want to support this channel, there are plenty of ways you can do that. You can drop us a like and let us know, hey, you're doing a great job, keep up the good work. You can also subscribe to the channel. Don't have to turn on notifications, but if you really want to follow us, that is the fastest way to know that we have uploaded a new video. And of course, you can also check out our website, freezenet.ca, and that is where we have all our latest news, music reviews, video game reviews, and we even have a full-fledged wiki so you can finally update that music collection so you can explore some new music on that as well. You can also subscribe to our Patreon page at patreon.com/freezenet, and that is a more direct way of supporting us, as well as coffee.com/freezenet. So I guess that is all for now, and until next time, keep it cool.